All right, so let's dive right into real estate lending standards.
Okay.
I know you guys are already pretty familiar with this stuff as FDIC examiners,
Mm-hmm.
but we're gonna kind of a little beyond the basics today, and we're gonna be looking at those key definitions and concepts from the ECFR, specifically 12 CFR Part 365 and Appendix A.
Right.
And think of this as your master class, kind of updated as of January 16, 2025.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, it's always good to revisit this stuff, especially for, seasoned examiners.
yeah.
The nuances can be surprisingly tricky sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So to set the stage a little bit, 12 CFR Part 365 lays out the standards for real estate lending
Hmm.
that FDIC supervised institutions use to develop their own internal lending policies.
Hmm.
And remember, this applies to any institution where the FDIC is the primary federal regulator.
That's right. And the overarching goal here is to promote safe and sound banking practices
Mhm.
across the board. We're talking about protecting the stability of the entire financial system, really.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's get into some of the nuts and bolts here. 365.2 outlines those essential elements of a solid real estate lending policy. And these policies must align with safe and sound banking practices, be tailored to the institution's size and operations. And then they have to undergo an annual review by the board.
Right. And I think it's worth emphasizing here that, these strong lending policies, they're not just a formality. They are absolutely fundamental to an institution's stability. They act as a safeguard, helping institutions manage those inherent risks of real estate lending effectively.
Yeah, for sure. Now let's turn to Appendix A, which gives detailed guidance to help institutions craft those, really solid real estate lending policies. And I like to think of it as like the instruction manual almost for examiners, and gives, really valuable context when you're assessing an institution's practices.
Okay. One section that deserves a close look is loan portfolio management considerations. This section emphasizes several key points, um, including the importance of a defined geographic focus.
Yeah.
Location, location, location. Right.
Right.
It's all about institutions sticking to areas that they know and understand.
Yeah, that makes sense. It also highlights the need for diversification within the loan portfolio.
Yeah.
Not putting all your eggs in one basket, so to speak, especially when it comes to like different types of loans.
Right. And it's not just about those external factors. Institutions also need to consider internal factors, carefully, like the size and expertise of their lending staff. Do they have the capacity to manage a diverse portfolio? Do they have specialized knowledge for different types of real estate
Yeah.
projects?
It's about aligning those lending activities with their capabilities and resources.
Exactly. And speaking of specialized knowledge, Appendix A also stresses the importance of understanding external market factors. So this includes things like demographic trends, zoning requirements, even economic indicators. Institutions need to analyze the market dynamics in the areas where they're lending.
Yeah, for sure. So let's move on to the underwriting standards section.
Right.
You could argue that this is kind of like the heart of the matter, where those detailed guidelines actually translate into real-world loan decisions.
Right. This section's all about the specifics. We're talking loan amounts, maturities, amortization schedules, loan-to-value limits. The list goes on. It provides a framework for ensuring that loans are structured prudently.
Yeah. And there's some interesting credit factors that institutions need to consider
Yeah.
when they're evaluating a borrower. Things
Right.
like capacity to service the debt, property's value, the borrower's creditworthiness, and equity levels. It's about painting that complete picture of the borrower's financial situation.
Right. It's a holistic assessment. And it's
Yeah.
worth noting that the guidelines get especially detailed. When it comes to development and construction projects, these inherently carry higher risk. So the scrutiny is understandably more intense.
Yeah, they really get into the weeds, talking about like feasibility studies, minimum equity requirements for the borrower, even like pre-leasing standards.
Exactly. All those details are there for a reason. Feasibility studies help ensure that the project is viable. Minimum equity requirements ensure that the borrower has skin in the game. And pre-leasing standards help mitigate that risk of ending up with an empty building.
Right, right. It's all about mitigating those inherent risks. So once a loan is made, obviously the story doesn't end there.
Yeah.
And the loan administration section is all about managing those loans proactively
Yeah.
and ensuring that they're performing as expected.
Right. Sound lending doesn't stop at underwriting. We're talking about ongoing monitoring and management here. It's about protecting the institution and ultimately the depositors.
Yeah, and that means meticulous documentation, right? Financial statements, collateral evaluations. Keeping everything organized and transparent is key.
Absolutely. Clear documentation is crucial. And this section emphasizes the importance of collateral administration. Are those loan payoffs happening on schedule? Are there clear procedures in place for collections and, if necessary, foreclosures?
Right. It's about having a plan for, every scenario.
Right. And this even includes how to handle delinquencies and potentially accepting deeds in lieu of foreclosure. Having clearly defined procedures helps ensure a consistent and fair approach, no matter what challenges arise.
Yeah. Okay, so let's tackle those supervisory loan-to-value limits, a concept that can sometimes trip people up.
Yeah, it's important to remember that institutions set their own internal loan-to-value limits, but they cannot exceed those supervisory limits that are outlined in the guidelines. It's like a safety net, a way to prevent institutions from taking on excessive risk.
Yeah. So it's a ceiling, a hard limit. And the guidelines lay out specific loan-to-value percentages for different loan categories, right?
Exactly. So for raw land, it's 65%. For land development, it's 75%. For construction, it ranges from 80 to 85%, depending on the project type. And then for improved property, it's 85%.
Okay. Now, what about those owner-occupied 1-to-4 family and home equity loans? I know those are handled a little bit differently.
Yeah, you're right. For those loans, there's no set limit. But any loan that originates with a loan-to-value ratio at or above 90%
Yeah.
needs some form of credit enhancement. That could be mortgage insurance or readily marketable collateral. It's about mitigating that extra bit of risk associated with higher loan-to-value ratios.
Okay. So if a loan needs to exceed those supervisory limits, are institutions just completely barred from doing that?
They're not entirely barred, but it's not a decision that's taken lightly. There are strict conditions and a much higher level of scrutiny for those loans. Examiners will be taking a very close look to ensure that the institution is managing that risk appropriately.
Yeah. So it's not just a free pass.
Absolutely not. And our source material highlights a crucial detail here. The aggregate amount of all loans that exceed those supervisory limits cannot exceed 100% of the institution's total capital. And for certain property types, commercial, agricultural, multifamily, or non-1-to-4 family residential properties, there's an even stricter limit of 30% of total capital.
Okay. So there are safeguards in place to prevent institutions from becoming overexposed to that type of risk.
Right. And the guidelines even specify what needs to be included when you're calculating that aggregate amount,
Right.
making it clear that it's not just about the individual loan, but the overall risk exposure.
Okay. So now I'm wondering, are there ever situations where those supervisory loan-to-value limits just don't apply?
There are, and the excluded transactions section outlines those specific scenarios. These are cases where, the inherent risk might be mitigated by other factors. So the loan to value limit might not be the deciding factor.
Okay, give me some examples.
Sure. So, for instance, loans guaranteed or insured by the U.S. government, or certain state or local governments fall under this umbrella. The backing of a government entity significantly reduces the risk there. There's also loans backed by the full faith and credit of a state government, and loans sold promptly after origination without recourse to a financially responsible third party. So essentially, the risk is shifted to another entity, and then there are loans that are renewed, refinanced, or restructured without advancing new funds or increasing the line of credit. So as long as it's not, adding to the existing debt, it might not trigger those same limits.
Okay, so there's a little bit of flexibility built into the system, but with very specific conditions, obviously. Yeah.
Exactly. It's not a blanket pass. Each exclusion has specific requirements that must be met for it to apply.
Okay. And it all comes back to maintaining those prudent lending practices, even when we're dealing with these exceptions.
Precisely. And speaking of prudent practices, let's move on to exceptions to the general lending policy. This section acknowledges that, real life scenarios aren't always black and white. Sometimes, even with the best guidelines, you encounter unique situations that require flexibility.
Yeah, because creditworthy borrowers can still have circumstances that fall outside of those standard policies.
That's right. The guidelines recognize that institutions may need to make exceptions, even to those loan to value limits we discussed.
Okay, so it's not a rigid one-size-fits-all system.
Exactly. But there's a critical caveat here. Any exceptions must be carefully documented and justified in writing. It's about transparency and accountability.
hmm It's about ensuring that those exceptions are truly warranted and not just a way to circumvent the rules.
Right. And it's crucial to remember those aggregate limits we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
Even with exceptions, institutions still need to stay within those boundaries
Yeah.
to avoid excessive risk exposure.
Yeah. So it's a balancing act. Flexibility is allowed, but within, carefully defined limits.
Right. And here's something that examiners pay close attention to. A high volume of exceptions can raise a red flag. It might signal a weakness in the institution's underwriting practices or a need to revisit their lending policies.
Right, like a sign that something might be amiss.
Exactly. Now, before we move on to those definitions, let's touch on supervisory review of real estate lending policies and practices.
Yeah.
This is where examiners like us come in,
Yeah.
ensuring that everyone is playing by the rules and maintaining the integrity of the system.
Yeah, because ultimately someone needs to be there to make sure that all those guidelines and policies are being implemented effectively and that institutions are truly adhering to, those safe and sound lending principles.
That's right. Examiners play a crucial role in assessing whether an institution's practices align with the regulations and guidelines. We're not just checking boxes. We're evaluating their overall approach to real estate lending.
Yeah. So what are some of the factors that examiners consider during a supervisory review?
Well, we take a holistic approach, considering the institution's size, financial condition, management quality, even market conditions.
Wow.
It's about understanding the context in which they're operating.
Yeah. So it's not just about the numbers. It's about understanding kind of the bigger picture.
Exactly. And here's a pro tip. Examiners pay close attention to those exception reports we talked about. A high volume of exceptions can be a sign of potential issues that warrant further investigation. It's often an indicator that something might be off.
Right. It's all about connecting those dots. So are you ready to dive into the world of definitions?
Let's do it.
I have a feeling these are going to be more interesting than they first appear.
You might be surprised how much nuance is packed into these seemingly simple terms. Let's start with construction loan. It might seem straightforward, but there's more to it than meets the eye.
Okay, so what exactly constitutes a construction loan according to the guidelines?
A construction loan is defined as an extension of credit, specifically for erecting or rehabilitating buildings or other structures. And this includes any necessary infrastructure for development.
Okay, so it covers a pretty wide range of activities, not just putting up the building itself.
Exactly. Now let's talk about extension of credit or loan. These terms might seem basic, but the guidelines provide a more nuanced definition.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So an extension of credit or loan encompasses the total amount of any loan, line of credit, or other legally binding lending commitment tied to real property. And here's the interesting part. It also includes any loans, lines of credit, or commitments that the lender acquires through purchases, assignments, or other means. So it considers the total potential liability associated with that real property.
Oh, wow. Okay, so it's not just about the initial loan amount. It's about the entire life cycle of the credit extended for that property.
Precisely. And speaking of property, let's move on to improved property loan. This definition gets quite specific.
So we're not talking about that fixer-upper down the street.
Yeah. Not quite. An improved property loan, according to the guidelines, is an extension of credit secured by one of several types of real property. So this could be actively managed farmland, ranch land, or timberland used for agricultural production. It also includes one before family residential properties that aren't owner-occupied, residential properties with 5 or more dwelling units, completed commercial properties or other income-producing properties. The key here is that that these properties are developed in either generating income or have the potential to do so.
Okay, so it's about properties that are like ready for use and occupancy,
Hmm.
excluding those owner-occupied 1 to 4 family residential properties.
Exactly. Now let's shift gears to land development loan, which takes us to the early stages of a project before any structures are built.
Okay, so this is where things get a little bit more raw, focusing on kind of like preparing the land for construction.
You got it. A land development loan is specifically for improving unimproved real property, getting it ready for those future buildings. We're talking about putting in sewers, water pipes, utility cables, streets, and other infrastructure necessary for development. It's about laying the groundwork, literally.
Okay, that makes sense. So what about loan origination? Is that as straightforward as it sounds?
It might seem that way, but the guidelines offer a more precise definition. So loan origination isn't simply when the paperwork is signed. It's the moment that the lender becomes legally obligated to extend credit.
Yeah.
It's the point of no return when the last controllable event or prerequisite takes place, binding the lender to fund that extension of credit.
Okay, so it's a more nuanced concept than just, the signing of a loan agreement. It's about that specific point in time
Yeah.
where the lender's commitment becomes legally binding.
Precisely. Now, let's move on to a term that we as examiners encounter frequently: loan to value or loan to value ratio. This is a crucial concept for assessing risk.
Yeah, it's all about understanding how much of the property's value is actually being financed by the loan, right?
That's right. The guidelines define it as the percentage or ratio
Yeah.
calculated at loan origination. You divide the extension of credit by the total value of the property, securing or being improved by that extension of credit. It's
Yeah.
important to consider any readily marketable collateral
Yeah.
and other acceptable collateral securing the extension of credit as well.
Right.
And don't forget to factor in the total amount of any senior liens or interests in the property when you're calculating that loan to value ratio. It's about getting a complete picture of the lending landscape for that property.
Okay. And what about situations where mortgage insurance or collateral is initially used in the calculation, but then later it's released or replaced? Does that affect the loan to value ratio?
It absolutely does. The loan to value ratio needs to be recalculated whenever there's a change in the credit enhancement.
Yeah.
It's not a static figure. It can evolve over the life of the loan.
Okay, so it's a dynamic measure that reflects kind of the changing risk profile of the loan.
Yeah.
What about other acceptable collateral? What falls under that category?
This can include a range of things. Essentially, it refers to any collateral in which the lender has a perfected security interest, and that has a quantifiable value. This could include things like unconditional, irrevocable standby letters of credit for the benefit of the lender, but it all has to be acceptable to the lender. According to safe and sound lending practices,
Okay, so it's not just limited to like real estate. It could be like financial instruments or other assets that provide security for the loan.
right. But there's a crucial point here. Any other acceptable collateral must be appropriately discounted by the lender. They need to factor in the potential for loss based on their usual practices for loans secured by that type of collateral.
Okay, so it's about taking a realistic view of the collateral's value, considering the potential for fluctuations or losses. What's next on our list of definitions?
Let's define owner occupied.
Yep.
Which is specifically related to 1 to 4 family residential property. It might seem straightforward, but there's a specific nuance in the guideline.
Okay, so it's more than just the owner living in the property.
That's right. The guidelines clarify that owner occupied means that the owner of the property lives in at least one unit of that property as their primary residence. This distinction is important because it differentiates between properties that are used as investments and those that are truly owner occupied homes.
Okay, so it's about drawing a clear line between those two categories. What about readily marketable collateral? What makes collateral readily marketable?
The guidelines specify that this type of collateral includes insured deposits, financial instruments, and bullion, where the lender has a perfected interest. The defining characteristic is that these assets must be easily sold under normal circumstances with reasonable promptness and at a fair market value.
Okay, so it's all about liquidity.
Yeah.
Can those assets be like quickly converted to cash without a significant loss in value?
Exactly. And the guidelines emphasize that the fair market value of this collateral must be determined by quotations based on actual transactions, either on an auction or a similarly available daily bid and ask price market. It's about having a reliable and transparent way to assess the value.
Mhm. And like other acceptable collateral, readily marketable collateral must also be, appropriately discounted by the lender,
Yeah.
considering those potential market fluctuations and risks.
Precisely. Now let's tackle the definition of value, which is all about determining the worth of the real property itself.
Right, right. I'm guessing we're not just talking about gut feelings here. There's got to be a more rigorous process for determining value.
You're absolutely right. The guidelines define value as an opinion or estimate of the market value of the real property, presented in either an appraisal or an evaluation, whichever is appropriate. And this valuation must be prepared in accordance with the agency's appraisal regulations and guidance.
Okay, so there's a framework in place to ensure that these valuations are, credible and reliable.
Exactly. And for loans to purchase an existing property,
Right.
value is specifically defined as the lesser of the actual acquisition cost or the estimated market value. This ensures a conservative approach to valuation, minimizing potential risks.
Okay. So it's about taking the more cautious approach when you're determining the property's value.
Yeah.
What's our final definition for today?
Let's wrap up with 1 to 4 family residential property. While this might seem self-explanatory, there's a nuance worth highlighting.
All ears. What's the catch?
The guidelines specify
Hmm?
that this category includes manufactured homes, but only if they're permanently affixed to the underlying property and considered real property under state law.
Oh, okay. So it's not just about the physical structure itself, but it's legal classification as well.
Yeah.
That's an important distinction.
It is. And that brings us to the end of our definitions for this deep dive.
Wow, we covered a lot of ground. Those definitions were definitely more intricate than I initially thought. Now, are you ready for a little challenge?
Bring on the quiz. Let's see how much we retained from this definitions deep dive.
Okay, so let's put those definitions to the test with a little quiz.
Yeah.
Get your thinking caps on, everybody. Question number 1. What is the supervisory loan-to-value limit for a construction loan on a 1 to 4 family residential property? Is it A, 65%, B, 75%, C, 80%, or D, 85%?
Okay.
Think back to those specific categories and limits we just discussed.
Right.
And the answer is D, 85%. Did you get it right?
Hopefully that was a nice warm-up.
Okay, question number 2. Which of the following is not considered readily marketable collateral? Is it A, a rare antique collection, B, insured deposits, C, financial instruments, or D, bullion?
Right.
Remember, it's all about liquidity. That ability to quickly convert an asset to cash without significant loss. Take a guess. What do you think it is? Yeah, the answer is A, a rare antique collection. While those antiques might be valuable, they don't have that same level of liquidity as insured deposits,
Right.
financial instruments, or bullion.
Right. Liquidity is key for readily marketable collateral.
Okay, last question. This is a true or false. True or false, an institution can never make an exception to the supervisory loan-to-value limits.
Okay.
Think carefully about that. Exceptions to the general lending policy section we discussed earlier.
Right.
Do those exceptions offer any flexibility at all?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer is false. Institutions can make exceptions. But remember, they have to be well documented, justified in writing, and still conform to those aggregate limits.
Right. It's all about finding that balance between flexibility and prudent risk management.
Absolutely. All right, so how did you do on our little mini quiz? Hopefully you aced it. But even if you missed a few, this deep dive should have been solid refresher on those essential definitions and concepts from 12 CFR Part 365 and Appendix A.
It's all about, layering that knowledge, building upon what you already know as experienced examiners.
Right. Now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about why these definitions and guidelines really matter.
Yeah.
How do they actually translate into real world scenarios
Yeah.
that you might encounter as FDIC examiners?
Yeah, these guidelines aren't just, abstract concepts. They're the tools we use to assess risk and ensure that institutions are operating safely and soundly. They help us ask the right questions and evaluate whether an institution is truly adhering to those prudent lending practices.
Yeah. Okay. So let's kind of walk through like a few hypothetical scenarios
Yeah.
to see how these concepts play out in practice. So imagine you're examining a community bank. That primarily lends to local businesses and individuals within a limited geographic area. Their bread and butter is residential mortgages, but they've recently started venturing into land development loans for a new subdivision project just outside their usual territory. So what are some red flags that might come to mind for you?
Well, this is where that concept of geographic focus becomes really important. Has this bank clearly defined the areas that they're comfortable lending in? Do they have the expertise to evaluate the risks associated with
Yeah.
this new market? It's one thing to underwrite a mortgage for a single family home in
Yeah.
a familiar neighborhood. It's quite another to assess the viability of
Mhm.
a large scale development project in a new area.
Yeah, that makes sense. And they're also, expanding into a new type of loan,
Yeah.
land development. So how would you assess their readiness for that?
Well, I'd want to delve into their loan portfolio management considerations. Have they established a diversification policy that accounts for this new potentially riskier type of loan? Are they putting all their eggs in one basket? And what about their internal loan to value limits for land development loans? Are those limits appropriate given the inherent risks? And of course, we also need to make sure that they're not exceeding those supervisory limits.
Right. So you'd be looking at both the individual loan level
Hmm.
and the overall portfolio composition, ensuring that they're managing risk, across the board.
Exactly. And given that this is a new area for them, we'd we'd want to, scrutinize their underwriting standards for land development loans. Do they have the expertise to evaluate the feasibility of this subdivision project? Are they requiring adequate equity investment from the borrower, ensuring that they, have skin in the game? Those feasibility studies and minimum equity requirements we discussed earlier become even more critical in this scenario.
Yeah. It's about ensuring that they're not just, writing a check,
Hmm.
but carefully assessing the project's viability
Right.
and the borrower's ability to manage those associated risks.
Right.
So what about their loan administration procedures?
Hmm.
How would you evaluate those?
I'd want to see how they're monitoring the progress of the development. Do they have clear guidelines
Mhm.
for handling potential cost overruns or delays? Construction projects are notorious for going over budget
Right.
and taking longer than expected. The bank needs to have procedures in place to address these challenges proactively.
Yeah. It's about making sure that they're actively managing the risk, throughout the life of the loan, not just at that initial underwriting stage.
Precisely. Now let's shift gears and imagine you're examining a larger regional bank that's more active in commercial real estate lending.
Okay, so a more sophisticated institution with
Yeah.
potentially more complex loans.
Exactly. Let's say they've made a significant loan for the construction of a high-rise office building in a major city. What are some key areas you'd focus on during your examination?
Well, right off the bat, I'd be thinking about the borrower's capacity to service the debt. We're talking about a large loan
Hmm.
for a major construction project, so their financial strength is paramount.
You're spot on. We need to be confident that the borrower can handle those payments, especially considering the inherent volatility of the commercial real estate market. Vacancy rates can fluctuate, impacting income streams, and interest rates can rise,
Right.
impacting debt service costs. We need to ensure that the borrower can weather those potential storms.
Right. And what about the property itself? How would you evaluate its value?
I'd carefully scrutinize the appraisal, ensuring that it's a quality assessment that considers current market conditions and the specific features of this office building. A poorly supported valuation can create problems down the line. It's crucial to have a realistic assessment of the property's worth, especially when you're dealing with a large loan.
Mhm. And since it's a construction loan, those specific guidelines would come into play, right?
Absolutely.
Right.
We'd want to verify that they've obtained feasibility studies to assess the project's viability. We'd also review their loan to value limits, ensuring that they align with the project's stage of completion and don't exceed those supervisory limits. And of course, we'd check whether the borrower has sufficient equity invested, demonstrating their commitment to the project.
Yeah. So you'd be looking at the loan from multiple angles, ensuring that it meets those construction specific guidelines, and that the bank is mitigating those inherent risks associated with such a large project.
Exactly. And beyond the initial underwriting, we'd also review their loan administration procedures for construction loans. Are they dispersing funds in a way that aligns with the project's progress? Are they monitoring those potential cost overruns and delays?
Right. It's about ensuring that they're actively involved throughout that entire construction process, not just, handing over a lump sum and hoping for the best.
Precisely.
Yeah.
They need to be vigilant in their oversight to protect themselves and the depositors' funds. Now, for our final scenario, let's imagine you're examining a smaller credit union that primarily makes residential mortgages to its members.
Okay, so back to a more community-focused institution.
Right, but even in this seemingly straightforward scenario, nuances can arise. Let's say they've made a loan to a member for the purchase of an owner-occupied 1 to 4 family dwelling. Seems pretty standard, right?
Yeah.
But there's a catch. The loan-to-value ratio at origination was 95%.
So we're venturing into that higher risk territory where credit enhancement is required.
Exactly. Remember, while these types of loans don't have a specific supervisory loan-to-value limit, anything at or above 90% needs either private mortgage insurance or a pledge of readily marketable collateral.
Right. It's about mitigating that extra bit of risk associated with a high loan-to-value ratio.
Right. So in this scenario, we'd want to confirm that the credit union has obtained the appropriate credit enhancement. We'd also want to review their underwriting standards for these high loan-to-value loans. Are they taking a close look at the borrower's creditworthiness, debt-to-income ratio, and employment history?
Right. Even though it's a member of the credit union, those sound underwriting practices still apply.
Absolutely. And we'd also want to ensure that they're not making too many of these high loan to value loans. Even though there's no specific limit, a high concentration of these loans can increase the credit union's overall risk exposure.
Yeah. It's all about balance and diversification, even within a specific loan category.
Precisely. These scenarios highlight how those definitions and guidelines we discussed earlier translate into real world examination procedures. It's not just about rote memorization. It's about applying that knowledge to assess risk and ensure those institutions are operating prudently.
Yeah. It's about connecting the dots, seeing how those seemingly dry regulations actually play out in the real world.
Exactly. And remember, these are just a few examples. Every examination is unique, and you'll encounter a wide range of scenarios throughout your career.
Yeah. So it's about being adaptable and applying these principles to each situation, using those guidelines as your roadmap. Yep. It's like having that detective's toolkit, using those regulations and definitions to uncover potential risks and ensure the safety and soundness of the institutions that we examine.
Exactly. It's about being thorough and asking those probing questions. Now, before we wrap up, I think it would be helpful to revisit those supervisory loan-to-value limits, especially in the context of the scenarios we just discussed.
Yeah, that's a great idea. It's one thing to understand those limits in isolation, but it's even more valuable to see how they actually play out in those actual examination situations.
Right. Let's go back to that community bank. Venturing into those land development loans, remember the supervisory loan-to-value limit for raw land is 65%. So if the bank is making a loan for, let's say, a 1 million parcel of raw land, the loan amount can't exceed $650,000 without triggering those stricter requirements for loans exceeding the limits.
Right. So that 65% limit acts as a safeguard, ensuring that the bank isn't isn't taking on too much risk
Yeah.
relative to the value of the underlying collateral.
Exactly. And it's worth emphasizing that this limit applies to the as-is value of the raw land, not the projected value after development.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. It's about basing that loan to value calculation on the current readily ascertainable value of a land, not on speculative future value.
Right. Now, what about that regional bank financing, the construction of that high-rise office building? Remember, for construction loans, the supervisory loan-to-value limit ranges from 80 to 85%, depending on the type of project.
Right, and in this case, we were talking about a commercial office building, so the limit would likely be 85%.
Exactly. So if the estimated total cost of the project is let's say $100 million, the bank can lend up to $85 million without exceeding that supervisory limit.
Okay, and again, it's crucial to remember
Yeah.
that this limit is based on the appraised value of the completed project, not just the cost of construction.
Right. The bank needs to consider the market value of the finished office
Yeah.
building, taking into account factors like potential rental income
Yeah, right.
and comparable property values in the area.
Yeah, so it's not just about the bricks and mortar. It's about the overall financial viability of the project.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that these supervisory loan to value limits aren't static. They can be adjusted by the FDIC
Yeah.
based on market conditions and other factors.
Right. So it's an evolving landscape, and examiners need to stay abreast of any changes to those limits.
Absolutely. It's crucial to refer to the most up-to-date guidelines and regulations when conducting examinations.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
So now let's touch on those owner-occupied 1 to 4 family residential properties where there isn't a specific supervisory loan to value limit. Remember, the trigger for heightened scrutiny is a loan to value ratio at or above 90%.
Exactly. So if that credit union made a $200,000 loan on a property valued at, let's say, $210,000, that loan to value ratio would be above 90%. We'd be looking for that credit enhancement, either private mortgage insurance or a pledge of readily marketable collateral.
Okay, so it's about recognizing those trigger points and understanding when those additional safeguards are required.
Right, and it's important to remember that even though there's no specific limit for these types of loans, a high concentration of high loan to value loans can still pose a risk to the institution.
Yeah, so it's about looking at the bigger picture, assessing that overall risk profile of the loan portfolio, not just individual loans in isolation.
Exactly, and that brings us to the heart of what we do as the FDIC examiners. We use these guidelines, these definitions, these tools to assess risk, ensure compliance, and ultimately protect the integrity of our financial system.
Yeah, it's about being the guardians of sound banking practices, safeguarding the interests of depositors.
Yeah.
And the stability of the financial system as a whole.
Well said. And I think this deep dive has provided a valuable refresher for even the most seasoned examiners, highlighting the nuances and complexities of real estate lending.
I agree. It's been a fantastic discussion, full of insights and practical applications.
And hopefully our listeners are walking away with a renewed appreciation for the importance of those definitions, those guidelines, and those supervisory loan to value limits.
Absolutely. They're not just abstract concepts. They're the foundation for safe and sound real estate lending practices. And with that, we've reached the end of our deep dive.
It's been a pleasure sharing these insights with you all.
Thanks for joining us. And until next time, happy examining.